All right, contents. So this is an extensive contents. Lecture 1, Moral Government. That has definition of the term law, distinction between physical and moral law, the essential attributes of moral law, liberty as opposed to necessity, adaptability or adaptation, universality, uniformity, impartiality, justice, practicability, independence, immutability, unity, equity, expediency, exclusiveness, and utility. Lecture 2, Moral Government Continued. Definition of the term government, distinction between moral and physical government, the fundamental reason of moral government, whose right it is to govern, what is implied in the right to govern, point out the limits of this right, what is implied in moral government, definition of moral obligation, the conditions of moral obligation, remarks. Lecture 3, Moral Government Continued. Man, a subject of moral obligation, extent of moral obligation, shown by an appeal to reason or to natural theology to what acts and states of mind moral obligation cannot directly extend. Shown to what acts and states of mind moral obligation must directly extend. To what acts and mental states moral obligation indirectly extends. Lecture 4, Foundations of Moral Obligation. Definition of moral obligation repeated. Attention called again to the conditions of moral obligation. What is intended by the foundation of moral obligation? The extent of moral obligation. Points of agreement among the principal parties in this discussion. Wherein parties differ. Shown from reason and revelation what must be the foundation of moral obligation. Shown wherein that consists, which constitutes the true foundation of moral obligation. In other words, in what the highest well-being or ultimate good of sentient beings consist. The ultimate and absolute good must belong to being or to sentient existences. With moral agents, at least the ultimate good must consist in a state of mind. The ultimate and absolute good, in the sense of the intrinsically valuable, cannot be identical with moral law. Obedience, or the course of acting or willing required by the law, cannot be the ultimate end aimed at by the law or the lawgiver. The absolute and ultimate good of being cannot consist in moral worth or good desert. Right character, moral worth, good desert, meritoriousness, or whatever you call it, cannot be or consist in a state of mind. The ultimate or absolute good cannot consist in anything external to mind itself. Objections to this philosophy considered. Lecture 5, Foundation of Moral Obligation. False theories. That the sovereign will of God is the foundation of moral obligation. The theory of Paley. The utilitarian philosophy. Lecture 6, Foundation of Moral Obligation. False theories. The theory that regards right as the foundation of moral obligation. Lecture 7, Foundation of Moral Obligation. False theories. The theory that the goodness or moral excellence of God is the foundation of moral obligation. Lecture 8, Foundation of Moral Obligation. False theories. The philosophy which teaches that moral order is the foundation of moral obligation. The theory that maintains that the nature and relations of moral beings is the true foundation of moral obligation. The theory that teaches that moral obligation is founded in the idea of duty. that philosophy which teaches the complexity of the foundation of moral obligation. Another form of the theory that affirms the complexity of the foundation of moral obligation, complex, however, only in a certain sense. Lecture 9. Foundation of Moral Obligation, Practical Bearings of the Different Theories. The theory that regards the sovereign will of God as the foundation of moral obligation. The theory of the selfish school. The natural and necessary results of utilitarianism. Lecture 10. Foundation of Moral Obligation. Practical Bearings of the Different Theories, continued. Practical Bearings and Tendency of Rightarianism. The philosophy which teaches that the divine goodness or moral excellence is the foundation of moral obligation. The theory which teaches that moral order is the foundation of moral obligation. The practical bearings of the theory that moral obligation is founded in the nature and relations of moral agents. The theory which teaches that the idea of duty is the foundation of moral obligation. The complexity of the foundation of moral obligation. The practical bearings of what is regarded as the true theory of the foundation of moral obligation, namely that the highest well-being of God and of the universe is the sole foundation of moral obligation. Lecture 11. Moral Government, continued. What constitutes obedience to moral law? Obedience cannot be partial in the sense that the subject ever does or can partly obey and partly disobey at the same time. Can the will at the same time make opposite choices? The choice of an ultimate end is, and must be, the supreme preference of the mind. An intelligent choice must respect ends or means. No choice whatever can be made inconsistent with the present choice of an ultimate end. Inquiry respecting the strength or intensity of the choice. The law does not require the constant and most intense action of the will. An intention cannot be right and honest, in kind, and deficient in the degree of intensity. Examination of the philosophy of the question whether sin and holiness consist in supreme, ultimate, and opposite choices or intentions. Objections to the foregoing philosophy considered. This philosophy examined in the light of the Scriptures. Lecture 12. Moral Government, continued. In what sense we have seen that obedience to moral law cannot be partial. In what sense obedience to moral law can be partial. The government of God accepts nothing as virtue but obedience to the law of God. There can be no rule of duty but moral law. Nothing can be virtue or true religion but obedience to the moral law. Nothing can be virtue that is not just what the moral law demands. That is, nothing short of what it requires can be, in any sense, virtue. Uses of the term justification. Fundamentally important inquiries respecting this subject. Remarks. Lecture 13. Moral Government, continued. What constitutes obedience to moral law? Just rules of legal interpretation. That actual knowledge is indispensable to moral obligation shown from Scripture. In the light of the above rules, inquire what is not implied in entire obedience to the law of God. Lecture 14, Moral Government Continued. Call attention to certain facts in mental philosophy as they are revealed in consciousness. Point out the attributes of that love which constitutes obedience to the law of God. Voluntariness, liberty, intelligence, virtuousness, disinterestedness, impartiality, universality. Lecture 15, Attributes of Love: Efficiency, Penitence, Faith, Complacency. Lecture 16, Attributes of Love Continued: Opposition, Compassion. Lecture 17, Attributes of Love Continued: Mercy, Justice, Truth or Truthfulness. Lecture 18, Attributes of Love Continued: Patience, Meekness, Long-suffering, Humility. Lecture 19, Attributes of Love Continued: Self-denial, Condescension, Candor, Stability, Kindness, Severity. Lecture 20, Attributes of Love Continued: Holiness or Purity, Modesty, Sobriety, Sincerity, Zeal, Unity, Simplicity. Lecture 21, Attributes of Love Continued: Gratitude, Wisdom, Economy. Lecture 22, Moral Government. Revert to some points that have been settled. Show what disobedience to moral law cannot consist in, what disobedience to moral law must consist in. Lecture 23, Moral Government. What constitutes disobedience? What is not implied in disobedience to the law of God? Lecture 24, Attributes of Selfishness. What constitutes disobedience to moral law? What is implied in disobedience to moral law? Attributes of selfishness: voluntariness, liberty, intelligence, unreasonableness, interestedness, partiality, impenitence, unbelief. Lecture 25, Attributes of Selfishness Continued: Efficiency, opposition to benevolence or to virtue, cruelty, unreasonableness, injustice. Lecture 26, Attributes of Selfishness Continued: Oppression, war, unmercifulness, falsehood or lying, pride. Lecture 27, Attributes of Selfishness Continued: Enmity, madness, impatience, intemperance, recklessness, unity. Lecture 28, Attributes of Selfishness Continued: Egotism, simplicity, total moral depravity implied in selfishness as one of its attributes. The Scriptures assume and affirm it. Remarks. Lecture 29, Moral Government. Obedience to moral law is and must be, under every dispensation of the divine government, the unalterable condition of salvation. Under a gracious dispensation, a return to full obedience to moral law is not dispensed with as a condition of salvation, but this obedience is secured by the indwelling Spirit of Christ received by faith to reign in the heart. Lecture 30, Moral Government. What constitutes the sanctions of law? There can be no law without sanctions. In what light sanctions are to be regarded? The end to be secured by law and the execution of penal sanctions. By what rule sanctions ought to be graduated? God's law has sanctions. What constitutes the remunitory sanctions of the law of God? The perfection and duration of the remunitory sanctions of the law of God. What constitutes the vindicatory sanctions of the law of God? Duration of the penal sanctions of the law of God. Inquire into the meaning of the term infinite. Infinites may differ indefinitely in amount. I must remind you of the rule by which degrees of guilt are to be estimated. That all and every sin must from its very nature involve infinite guilt in the sense of deserving endless punishment. Notwithstanding, all sin deserves endless punishment, yet the guilt of different persons may vary indefinitely, and punishment, although always endless in duration, may and ought to vary in degree according to the guilt of each individual. That penal inflictions under the government of God must be endless. Examine this question in the light of Revelation. Lecture 31. Atonement. I will call attention to several well-established governmental principles. Define the term atonement. I am to inquire into the teachings of natural theology or into the a priori affirmations of reason upon this subject. The fact of atonement, the design of atonement, Christ's obedience to the moral law as a covenant of works did not constitute the atonement. The atonement was not a commercial transaction. The atonement of Christ was intended as a satisfaction of public justice. His taking human nature and obeying unto death under such circumstances constituted a good reason for our being treated as righteous. Lecture 32. Extent of atonement. For whose benefit the atonement was intended. Objections answered. Remarks on the atonement. Lecture 33. Human government. The ultimate end of God in creation. Providential and moral governments are indispensable means of securing the highest good of the universe. Civil and family governments are indispensable to the securing of this end, and are therefore really a part of the providential and moral government of God. Human governments are a necessity of human nature. This necessity will continue as long as human beings exist in this world. Human governments are plainly recognized in the Bible as a part of the moral government of God. It is the duty of all men to aid in the establishment and support of human government. It is absurd to suppose that human governments can ever be dispensed with in the present world. Objections answered. Inquire into the foundation of the right of human governments. Point out the limits or boundary of this right. Lecture 34. Human governments continued. The reason why God has made no form of church or civil government universally obligatory. The particular forms of church and state government must and will depend upon the virtue and intelligence of the people. That form of government is obligatory that is best suited to meet the necessities of the people. Revolutions become necessary and obligatory when the virtue and intelligence or the vice and ignorance of the people demand them. In what cases human legislation is valid, and in what cases it is null and void. In what cases we are bound to disobey human governments. Apply the foregoing principles to the rights and duties of governments and subjects in relation to the execution of the necessary penalties of law. Lecture 35. Moral depravity. Definition of the term depravity. point out the distinction between physical and moral depravity. Of what physical depravity can be predicted? Of what moral depravity can be predicated? Of what physical depravity can be predicated? Of what moral depravity can be predicated? Mankind are both physically and morally depraved. Subsequent to the commencement of moral agency and previous to regeneration, the moral depravity of mankind is universal. The moral depravity of the unregenerate moral agents of our race is total. 36. Moral depravity continued. Proper method of accounting for the universal and total moral depravity of the unregenerate moral agents of our race. Moral depravity consists in selfishness, or in the choice of self-interest, self-gratification, or self-indulgence as an end. Dr. Wood's view of physical and moral depravity examined. Standards of the Presbyterian Church examined. 37. Moral depravity continued. Further examination of the arguments adduced in support of the position that human nature is in itself sinful. Lecture 38. Moral depravity continued. The proper method of accounting for moral depravity. Prest Edwards' views examined. Summary of the truth on this subject. Remarks. Lecture 39. Regeneration. The common distinction between regeneration and conversion. I am to state the assigned reasons for this distinction. I am to state the objections to this distinction. What regeneration is not. What regeneration is. The universal necessity of regeneration. Agencies employed in regeneration. Instrumentalities employed in the work. In regeneration, the subject is both passive and active. What is implied in regeneration? See, that was lecture 39. This is lecture 40. Regeneration continued. Philosophical theories of regeneration. The different theories of regeneration examined. Objections to the taste scheme, the susceptibility scheme, theory of a divine moral suasion. Objections to this theory. Remarks. 41. Regeneration continued. Evidences of regeneration. Introductory remarks, wherein the experience and outward life of saints and sinners may agree. Remarks. Lecture 42. Regeneration continued, wherein saints and sinners or deceived professors must differ. Lecture 43. Regeneration continued. In what saints and sinners differ. What is it to overcome the world? Who are those that overcome the world? Why do believers overcome the world? Lecture 44. Regeneration continued, wherein saints and sinners differ. Finney's lectures on systematic theology.